Right then, if you're watching this, that means you've clicked on part 2 of the story of my life. Now, if you haven't seen part 1, may I suggest that you stop right now, you go back and find part 1 and watch that first. Now, you can of course find that on the YouTube channel of Race Across Europe 2019, or if you're following this link on Facebook, scroll further down the page of Race Across Europe 2019 and you will find the link to part 1 there. Now, after watching this part, may I actually ask that you don't judge too quickly unless you're prepared to watch part 3, and there will be a part 4 which gives parts 1 to 3 a bit more cohesion, because of course this isn't an entire story of my entire life, because that would actually take days. However, in part 4, not only do I give parts 1 to 3 a bit more cohesion, but I also explain why I felt the need to talk about my life as part of this trip around Europe, okay? And it will also talk briefly about some of the things that I've done more recently which have a relevance to my past. So, without further ado, carry on watching. Conversations with him. But anyway, back to when I was sort of 16 years old, I basically, it was the time of the rave scene, and that all sort of kicked off, and I was kind of always this kid that was on the social outside of a group. There, you know, you had the bullies, and you had like the people that people would look up to, you know, the in girl or the in boy, and I always got along with those sort of people, but I always made sure I got along with the people that say the victims of bullying. I wouldn't bully people. But I made sure that I would be friends with both, and I was always this sort of person on the outside, and because I'd always hung around with the older kids, people were very cautious of me. They didn't really quite know how to take me, because I was quite quiet unless I was with my close friends, of which there was, you know, a small handful. Now, like I say, it was the time when the rave scene hit, and we all started smoking marijuana, and that's pretty much been the bane of my life, to be honest with you. Not that I smoke it now, of course, but and I wouldn't say I got mixed up with the wrong crowd, not at all, but I started buying and selling it, and I found that I got a respect from people because I had something they wanted, and it actually finally made me some money where I could treat myself to an evening out, or you know, buy a pair of trainers, for instance. Now that was very short-lived, as you will find out, because I was only 15, 16. By the time I was 17, I'd already been caught selling it. I'd been in court a couple of times for possession, what they class as possession of a controlled substance, or possession with intent to supply. I'd been fined. And then to give you an idea, this is the big thing, to give you an idea of just how loyal I am. Especially when it comes to money, okay? Because I did say in a previous recording that I would explain that money has had a big influence in my life. I remember actually buying quite a substantial amount of cannabis off of this guy, and these aren't the sort of people that you want to let down with money. And how it used to work is you would actually be given it, and you'd have a certain amount of time to give the money over. Now, I can't really remember exactly what went on, but one way or another, I ended up in debt of about £600, and it's not a substantial amount of money, especially nowadays. Back then it was a fair bit, but it wasn't an unmanageable amount. But in order to pay this debt back to the nasty people, I borrowed £600 off of a very, very good friend. Now, he could afford it, he had the money, and he quite openly lent it to me. And I felt really guilty that I owed him this money, and I wanted to pay it back as quick as possible. And he wanted it for, I think he wanted it to buy a car or something, and I just went and done the most stupidest thing, and it is probably the most stupidest thing in my life. No, without a shadow of a doubt, it is definitely the most stupidest thing in my life. Is I actually went and got an old antique shotgun out of my friend's dad's loft, a different friend, and held up a sports centre with it, with wearing a balaclava. And I robbed this sports centre for, it was £916.24, to be precise, of which all I'd done was bought myself breakfast the next morning with, sole intents and purposes of giving my friend that I owed the £600 his money back. And I'd done that purely because I felt loyal and I felt indebted to this person. Violent crime is something that I've never been interested in. It's something I've never really done. And don't get me wrong, I would defend myself in any shape or form if I had to, but I never really had to, apart from a couple of times survive in prison, because obviously doing armed robbery, you go to prison. So yeah, I say we because it's myself and a co-defendant. A friend actually helped me as a lookout, and unfortunately he got dragged into it. I tried to keep him out, and the same as when he got questioned by the police, he was as loyal as I am, and he tried to take the blame for it and keep my name out of it. So basically the police obviously put two and two together, and we were both in it together. And originally I got sentenced 7 years in a youth offenders institute, so basically prison, and he got sentenced 5. Now I went straight on remand, before sentencing of course. I went straight on remand in Chelmsford prison, and my co-defendant actually got was released until the actual trial. And I know when the trial came about, other offences were taken into account, which was more drug offences, all cannabis, no hard drugs. Never believed in hard drugs. Yeah, we ended up going to Aylesbury Prison, which was one of the highest category prisons in the country, mixing with lifers, people that have committed rape and murder and stuff like that. And prison teaches you a lot, I can tell you that now. Not all bad, not all good. And I was in prison for 2.5 years until I got my parole. Because I got my sentence reduced at the Old Bailey to 5 years and my co-defendant to 4 years, I done near enough to the day half of my sentence. I kept my nose clean, I didn't get into any trouble, or none that I actually got caught anyway. And because I left school without any qualifications, because quite frankly I was already working in a factory at 15, well I was working in a factory at 13. By the time I come around to being 16, it's like, I've got money, albeit £1 an hour, but I've got money, why do I need these qualifications? And like an idiot left school without even doing any exams. Realised the errors of my way in prison, and now I actually went and got myself a bloody good set of qualifications in prison. I'm degree qualified, I've got lots of city and guilds, a distinction in everything, and that's where my electrical qualifications come from. And all my certifications got Aylesbury College written on it, because the prison, it was Aylesbury Prison where I was. Aylesbury Prison is part of the local college there, so future employers don't need to know that my qualifications came from prison. Now, prison's something that I don't generally talk about to anyone, not because I'm necessarily embarrassed about the fact that I've been in prison. A lot of people don't really understand that people can change, or that there are, in certain cases, extenuating circumstances that put people in prison. And not all people in prison are bad people. For instance, I met a Muslim guy who was in there serving 9 years. He was in McDonald's in Luton. A skinhead came in and basically started racially abusing him and his fellow Muslims. And this actual skinhead pulled a knife, because this Muslim guy actually turned around and said, look, you know, will you please leave us alone? We've done nothing wrong. We don't want any trouble. We're just here to eat some food. And this skinhead, drugged up, drunk, whatever, pulled a knife, and there was a struggle. And one way or another, the Muslim guy defended himself. The knife got turned and went into the skinhead, and the skinhead died. Now, this Muslim guy got sentenced 9 years for that, for manslaughter. And quite frankly, those sort of things I think are just outrageous. And you do see a lot of injustices in prison. People that shouldn't get the sort of sentences they got, but equally so, you do see a lot of people getting short sentences that should get a lot longer. Anyway, so I left prison 2.5 years later, still green or wet behind the ears, and one thing that I've found out as I've got older is that, you know, I believe statistically males are 4 years more immature behind females in the latter part of their teens. So if you've got a 20-year-old girl and a 20-year-old boy, the 20-year-old girl is acting like a 20-year-old girl, the 20-year-old boy is acting like a 16-year-old boy. So the other thing I realised is because when you're in prison you don't have the normal social interaction, your maturity, realistically, or part of it, pretty much stops. So I come out of prison at 21, which, as I've just explained, my maturity would be 17, but I hadn't really done much growing up in prison in actual maturity. So I'm going to put my actual sort of understanding on life probably a few years younger than that, and it took quite a while to grow up after I come out of prison. I was paroled for a few years. I was actually paroled from my sister's house. She was a police officer and her husband was running for a local election. He didn't like the fact that I was paroled to their address, and I lasted there probably about 3 weeks before I got kicked out. I hadn't done anything wrong, it was just too difficult to be there, and I spent the next 6 months living either sleeping rough on the streets, or I remember once I did have a car, sleeping in the car, and I was feeding myself around friends' houses, and it's basically stealing vegetables out of local allotments. Now, if the authorities found out that I was doing that, not the stealing vegetables bit, but found out that I was sleeping rough and not that I wasn't at the address that I was paroled to, I would have been straight back inside. So yeah, it was a bit of a tough time, really. Now, after prison, I should say 84% of people, or 84% of young offenders, re-offend because they don't learn their lesson inside. Now, most of the time, these 84% of re-offenders re-offend a very similar crime or a worse crime. Now, I'm not going to say I didn't break any laws when I come out of prison, because I certainly did, but they were nothing like armed robbery. There's no chance I'd ever have done that again. But I did get back into the same social circle of people dealing drugs, stuff like that. I personally didn't get involved with that. Been there, done that, big mistake. I did immediately start work, full-time work, thanks to jobs given to me, you know, by my brother. You know, there was periods of time. I've always been a worker. I've never signed on. You know, I found that quite lame. I've never had any difficulty finding work. But I still hung around with the sort of people that were in the drug scene and stuff like that, because, you know, my friends from before prison were still my friends after prison, and the whole time I'd been in prison, they had moved on and they was taking, you know, acid and, you know, LSD and ecstasy. Right, so if you're watching this, that means you've already seen from the beginning of the film that it was recorded in Macedonia a month ago, actually. Excuse me. But what actually happened during the recording of that film, or actually the hour and a half I was talking to camera, is the camera actually cut out several times, memory cards filled up, batteries went flat, there was all sorts of problems. So there was chunks that got missed, and when I'd realised the camera switched off, I'd lost sort of train of thought, and between camera switching off and where I'd finished talking to camera being back on and where I started talking, there were certain lumps missing. Now, this is an infill because the bit that was missing was fairly important to telling the story of the criminality of the group or groups of people that I was mixed up in at the time. So where the camera switched off, reviewing the footage myself, I was talking about that friends that I had before prison were friends that I had after prison. Now, some of these friends were, like before I was in prison, getting large quantities of cannabis off of certain people, and these certain people were kingpin people in the East End or the South East, some of them quite well renowned. Now, obviously I'm not going to mention any names because that would just be stupid and potentially suicidal, but to give you an idea, and this is not a boastful thing, it's just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. Now, a lot of you would have seen certain films about the Essex boys, okay, who basically ended up dead in a Range Rover in Rettendon in Essex. Now, most people would have heard of the story if they've not seen the films. Now, I can tell you now that the majority of the films, or near enough all of the films that have come out, are complete crap, okay? Now, there's only one film that's got even closely relevant to the truth, and that is Rise of the Foot Soldier. So if you've ever seen that film, I can tell you now that that film is actually about as close to the truth that you're ever going to get, okay? Now, the Rise of the Foot Soldier starts with basically football hooliganism in the late 70s, early 80s. Well, I can tell you now that they were West Ham supporters and the renowned ICF, the intercity firm. And sure enough, as the film dictates, as some of them pulled away from that and got into the drug scene when the rave scene hit at the end of the 80s, and then started basically making their money from buying and selling drugs basically in the southeast of England. Yeah, so you get an idea of the type of people I'm talking about when I say like things like when I was a lot younger and I didn't want to owe money to certain groups of people, borrowed it off of a friend, felt indebted to the friend, committed an armed robbery to pay a friend back. That shows my loyalty over money and friendship to that point. And I'm still pretty much the same today. I just wouldn't do something as stupid. But basically, where the film cut out was I had the same friends before and after prison, okay? So I still knew these people. Now, I didn't have any specific direct dealings with them, and as I either mentioned before or I'm going to mention after this, I was an information gatherer in various different ways. Not going to explain in fine detail how, but you know, I knew so many people, and I knew certain people that were, like I say, kingpin gangsters, if you like, for want of a better term. To give you an example of just how bad these people could be, they actually found out about someone who I actually know, funnily enough, who was growing marijuana in a house, and they sent some heavies round there with a shotgun, 3 heavies with a shotgun, and to basically find out where this marijuana was being grown. What actually happened was they'd been misinformed, and it was actually 3 marijuana plants growing in a cupboard under some stairs, and what they'd been told is it was 3 houses full of marijuana. And you know, we are talking about the early 90s, so you know that would have been an awful lot of money involved, and a level of organisation to have 3 houses full of marijuana back in the 90s, when it was really unheard of in the UK. So yeah, these 3 guys basically went through the door of someone I know, their house in Westcliff-on-Sea, and the younger brother was there. He was tied up, he was literally tortured. He had razor blades shoved through his fingers and stuff like that. At that point, the elder brother walked in and was confronted by the shotgun. It basically, a few names were mentioned, key people who eventually ended up being murdered in Range Rovers in Rettington, and basically it was said to the elder brother who just walked through the door that this person wanted to know the information and the location of all of this marijuana, which didn't actually exist. And it was when they went to lower the shotgun to take his knees out that this elder brother that I knew basically knew it was now or never and kicked the gun to one side. The gun went off into the wall, fortunately for him, and he was a big guy, and before basically the gun could be brought back round again, he just went absolutely apeshit, threw coffee tables at them. He picked up his car keys, had a little Swiss Army knife on it, and he thought he'd stabbed with this Swiss Army knife in total self-defense. He thought he stabbed these 3 guys. Actually turned out he stabbed one of them 3 times, and they all ran out of the house. Next thing, the police got a call because someone with stab wounds was in a phone box, and basically what it was, the 3 assailants, if you like, the 2 that didn't get stabbed phoned the police and ambulance to basically make aware that one needs medical help, serious medical help. Now that's how it all come to light. Obviously the neighbours in this house heard the shotgun going off, so the police got called to there as well. Police put 2 and 2 together and realised this was all of the same incident, because there was blood up the walls and blood across the ceiling. And I see the state of the place, okay? So I'm the type of person that has always sat in the middle of this sort of shit that has gone on. And like I've said before, or I'll say after this clip, you know, I've always known to keep this shut and keep these open, and I've always been respected for that. So basically, yeah, these are the type of people I mean, and I'm sure by mentioning you know, the Rettington murders and the Essex Boy films, you know, some of you can pretty much guess the group of people I'm talking about. So fortunately I never got deeply involved with them, but I hasten to say that, you know, I did sometimes drive them around. I was there when deals were done, and I think, as I'm going to say, I am actually quite lucky not to have been murdered in a Range Rover many years ago in Rettington. So I'll leave it at that. Hopefully what I've just said will fit in how I remember the gap that needs filling. So I think that's all that needs to be said for part 2. I'll probably have to do something similar to this for part 3. Right, so I'll let you carry on with the rest of it. Right, well, that didn't work out too well, because for whatever reason the camera turned off. Kind of stopped me in my flow. Made me realise there's quite a few bits that I'd missed out that were quite important. So I think I'm going to have to do a bit of editing with this to make it a little bit more fluid story. But so where did I get to? Yes, the type of people that I was associating with after I come out of prison, like I said, were quite renowned criminals, and I used to do a little bit of running around for them, and I was very lucky in one respect, quite possibly not to be the driver getting my head blown off. That was a bit of an eye-opener to sort of separate yourself from the scene. One thing I did mention is that I used to steal cars. One of the things that I was quite good at the time was stealing cars. Used to actually steal them to order, and they used to go to. I had some contacts in, which is how I know quite a few people. A lot of cars would basically disappear out of the county, because back in those days it used to take days for information of stolen cars to go across county borders. It was you know, the information of flowing the police force back then was nothing like it is these days. So a lot of the cars would get stolen and go to Kent and basically be rung over with new identities and sold at auction. So yeah, and another thing that because I was always on the fringes of several different groups of people, and I would be accepted, but I would keep my ears open, my mouth bloody well shut. And people knew that I'd keep my mouth shut because, you know, I've been in prison. I hadn't divulged any information I knew when I went in prison to drop anyone in the shit to reduce my sentence, so I was trusted. So I used to keep my ears open and my mouth shut, and I was kind of used as a bit of an information gatherer. And I was quite good at finding people that owed money, because I had quite a large network of associates that I could move around in freely and just pick up tidbits of information. And you know, as long as people hadn't left the area, and if they were still Essex based, for instance, it was always quite easy for me to get wind of where they were. And it's this information network, and some of these guys from back then, I still know today. Funnily enough, one of them actually owns an equestrian centre that recently, in the last 12 months, went up for housing. And I bumped into him on an equestrian job, and sort of, it was like, oh my God, it's you, and it's like, yeah, it's you, and sort of got reacquainted, shall we say, and you know, both has obviously got out of the criminal world years ago, some in a lot more profitable ways than others. I know there are some guys from back in those days that made a lot of money from the drug scene, who have used that money to start successful businesses these days and own houses in Spain and have legitimate businesses now. And none of that would have happened if they didn't have that money behind them in the first place, which come from criminal means. So yeah, I got out of that scene. And I can't remember exactly when it was, but I know in the early 90s I spent some time in Holland, and I got talking to the Dutch, got friendly with some of the Dutch guys over there. I ended up spending 3 months in Amsterdam or its neighbouring areas, and I actually learnt, I was one of the first people in the UK that actually learnt about how to grow marijuana. And that actually came a pivotal point for me, because I was, through the 90s, one of the first people to actually be growing marijuana in the UK. And it was also the reason why I have epilepsy now, because I was growing so much of it, I was smoking like it was going out of fashion. Marijuana, I'd be constantly stoned day in, day out for years and years and years. And I actually stopped smoking it the day I had an epileptic fit. And ever since, and that was 2003, and ever since I had the epileptic fit, I can't go anywhere near the stuff without the paranoia that I'm going to have another fit. And fortunately, the epilepsy is well controlled now, but it's taken many years to get it under proper control. In fact, it's only in the last sort of 12, 18 months, so 10 years of bouts of paranoia and more fits and stuff like that, that it's really got under control. And you know, there has been someone recently in my life who's actually helped me with that, and I'm very appreciative of them being it for me. One of the things with epilepsy, it used to be originally, I used to fit in my sleep. It was only once or twice a year, you know, or even sometimes every it used to go a couple of years. And I thought it was fairly well under control. And at one point, I tried to come off of the medication because I wanted to become a ski guide. Because at that point, I'd started snowboarding semi-professionally in France, and I wanted to become a high mountain guide. And I'd already started the mountain leader course in the UK, and I'd already had the logbook, and I'd done these routes, and I'd had it all signed off, and I'd guides signing stuff off for me. But the only thing I had to do was be medication free, because you're not allowed to have something like epilepsy to be a high mountain guide, because you've got to be in the safety. You know, you are looking after, you know, 6 or 7 clients at a time, and their lives are in your hands. So you can't be at risk of having an epileptic fit as a guide up, you know, 3,000-4,000 meters up the mountains. So I tried to come off the drugs, and I very nearly got off the drugs, and I actually then had another fit. And clearly, you know, the medical profession said, no, you are obviously definitely epileptic as a permanent thing. You're going to have to take the drugs for the rest of your life. So my dream job, the one thing I wanted to do, move to France, become a high mountain guide, that just went straight out the bloody window. And then for whatever reason, I started actually fitting during the daytime, and it was and it always seemed to be while I was eating, and that has had a massive effect on my life. Even now, I still don't really eat with a knife and fork, because there's always that paranoia in the back of my mind. What if I have another fit? And so I went, and I suffer a fair amount of OCD, you know, cleanliness and stuff like that. I can't stand, never used to like touching food with my hands, and now I generally only eat with my hands. But a couple of times I had fits at a local cafe near where I work, and my brother had been with me once, and a couple of times I had a good friend with me, and you know, they'd looked after me, and it's very disorientating when you come out of a fit. You don't really quite know what's going on, and when I first had epilepsy, I would lose days, literally days of my life. Wouldn't have a clue what had happened the previous day, and I found it quite frustrating. Whereas now, when I come out of a fit, within minutes, I can even remember going into the fit, and I can remember that whole scared thought of you're like you're inside your own head, screaming for help, but you can't speak, you can't move, and you actually can't breathe. And it's actually only when you physically go unconscious from lack of oxygen is when you actually blank out and you know nothing else about it. But those seems like to me seconds, but it's probably like 20-30 seconds up to that point where I am screaming. I can still picture it now. I can that when I'm going into a fit, every time I'm thinking, is this going to be it? Am I dying? So yeah, epilepsy massively has affected me. Anyway, so I stopped smoking marijuana back in 2003, and I'd moved on in my life where I'd been in permanent employment for quite some time. I had a house, or actually technically on my second house. I had a house up in Lincolnshire. On my first trip out to France, well, it's probably I need to roll back a little bit actually, because